Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started shortly. See a few familiar names. Welcome, everyone. Morning, Jim. Just a little housekeeping. We will be using the question and answer pod. So if you have any questions, please type them in there as we're going through the presentation today. It's 9:01. I'm going to give it a couple minutes before I start here. We still have some people joining. All right, it looks like we've got most everyone on the line now, so we'll get started. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Tim Hunt. I'm the Highway Superintendent in Lewis County. I do presentations for Cornell Local Roads, and today we're talking about managing our fleet. And the titles of our seminars are the why. These are called why seminars. So before I get into it real deeply, I want to talk a little bit about why we're talking about managing our fleet. So the why is because we're given a pot of money as highway superintendents, whether it's county, town, state, we're given a pot of money from the taxpayers to improve our assets. And what we do know is that that pot of money doesn't grow very often. We're limited with a 2% property tax cap. A lot of our elected officials know that there's a huge burden on our tax base and we can't continue to grow that. So what we have to do is try to figure out how to manage that pot of money as effectively as possible to maintain our assets. So let's talk a little bit about that. When we get that pot of money, we essentially, as highway superintendents, spend money on one of three things: equipment, labor, and materials. And those three things are how we take care of all of the assets that we're responsible for. So let's kind of look at that pie. And I want to show you the budget that I have here in Lewis County and how that pie looks. So I have an $8.7 million budget that I manage, and that's broken into three separate slices. So materials is about $5.3 million. That's asphalt, culvert pipes, all of the things that we would buy to maintain our road system, whether it's guide rail or culvert, any of that type of stuff. Labor is $2.4 million, or about 28% of the budget. And equipment is about $1 million a year, or 11% of the budget. So what we do know is that pie is not going to get much bigger unless we get an increase in CHIPS money or we might get to see a 2% growth in the overall size of it. So the question is, how do we distribute these different categories in a way that's most efficient so that we can take care of our assets? If the pie doesn't increase, how would you change the individual slices in your pie to improve your road network? And that's a question that I challenge all of you. Go back and look at your budget and look at how it's being distributed and what percentages go to equipment, labor, and materials, and try to think if that's the right balance. Because the biggest thing we can do if we can't increase the pie is to make sure that each slice of it is appropriately allocated so that we can get the most return on our investment. Equipment expenses reduce money available for labor and material. One of the things that I see looking at county budgets over a long period of time is that as we forget to invest in capital purchases of new equipment, the equipment pie, the equipment slice gets bigger because as we don't replace our equipment, operating costs go up. And as they go up, more of our budget is devoted to maintaining our fleet. And as that happens, we have less money available for labor and we have less money available for material. So making sure that you're being efficient with your equipment is really the first step in making sure that the money is being allocated properly toward labor and material. The second piece is equipment should match your labor force. More equipment than employees or more employees than equipment, right? And we've seen both of these scenarios of go into a town where they might have 3 employees, but they have 20 pieces of equipment. Does that make a lot of sense? So you really got to look at your utilization of the equipment and how it relates to your labor. If you don't have enough people to run the equipment, that's not efficient. And if you have more people than you have equipment, that's not efficient either, because what we know now is that equipment really helps your labor force become more productive, i.e. 3 employees, 3 snowplows, right? If you had 6 snowplows and 3 employees, that might be a problem. It might make sense to have 4 so you have a spare, but you really want to start to look at your labor in relationship to your equipment. So some key concepts, and we're going to dig into each one of these very deeply. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer pod. So the first component is right-sizing your fleet, making sure that fleet fits your needs. And it's different, right? We know we have some towns with 15 miles of road, 30 miles of road, 80 miles of road. In my case, I have 250 miles of road. There's some very large municipalities that have a completely different need. And it also depends on the infrastructure you're taking care of. Is it just roads? Is it roads and bridges? Is it drainage systems, water systems? There's all sorts of different equipment required depending on what you're taking care of. So the first concept is right size the fleet. The second one is buy the right equipment. And we'll talk a lot more about that. Maintain an accurate inventory, including the usage of that equipment. What a lot of people fail to realize is that equipment has a cost per hour, just like an employee does. And the analogy that I like to tell people is you wouldn't hire a full-time employee if you only needed them 10 hours a week. And that's the same thing with equipment. You wouldn't buy a piece of equipment if you only need it for 10 hours a week, because there's an hourly cost to that piece of equipment or that capital investment that you're making. So you need to have accurate records to understand your utilization. Consider how equipment affects your labor productivity. Keep equipment properly maintained. Consider purchase price and disposal price, because our operating cost of this equipment is predicated on what we paid for it minus what we sold it for. So both of those things need to be a consideration when you're purchasing a piece of equipment and maintaining it. Keep accurate maintenance records of all of your equipment so that you can, one, demonstrate that to a potential buyer when you go to sell it, but also to make sure that you're properly maintaining it for safety reasons. So let's talk a little bit about right-sizing the fleet. First of all, don't start with what you have. This is probably the most common mistake that I see when I go into different towns throughout the state is you ask people, well, how did you come up with your fleet, the mix of vehicles? And a lot of times they'll say, it was what was here. It was what we inherited, right? And what I like to do is start with a blank slate of paper and just say, if we had nothing, if everything was gone and you could design the exact fleet of equipment that you wanted that made the most sense for you, would it look like what you have now? And so if you design the perfect fleet, you take your existing fleet, you can start to go, okay, when I replace that, I'm going to replace it with something different, or I'm going to change how the mix of this fleet looks. So don't start with what you have, start with what you would like to have. Imagine that perfect fleet. Consider your labor productivity with this. This is a huge one that I think gets overlooked a lot. And when I say consider your labor productivity, way back when I first started as a highway superintendent many years ago, we would send guys out in the spring with chainsaws to cut brush. And we'd send the entire crew out. I'd send 10 guys out for weeks at a time to cut brush back. We purchased one boom mower, and it did more work in one day than our crew could do in a week of 10 guys. So I could put one guy in that one tractor, which essentially was way cheaper than having 10 people out there cutting brush back, and be able to manage that so much better. So you want to consider how the labor or how the equipment impacts your labor productivity. Make sure that you're providing your employees with the right tools to make them as efficient as possible. And sometimes that's in the little details when you're ordering and speccing equipment. A loader with a pin-on bucket versus a loader with a quick coupler where you could put forks on it, you could put a broom on it, you could have multiple attachments. Would that make your employees more productive when they're out there? So those are the kind of questions you want to ask about every piece. What can we do to help our labor become more productive? Would you rather have a piece of an equipment or an employee? I pose this all the time, even to myself, whenever I'm considering a purchase of a piece of equipment or I'm considering hiring an employee. Which one is going to provide me the most productivity? And surprisingly, when you start looking at a piece of equipment, it's pretty comparable to what it costs you to hire someone. Both of those are a decision about this pot of money that we have, which slice do I want to put it in? And by all means, I am not suggesting that equipment is more important than employees. It's not. You cannot do anything without good employees, but you need to give them the right tools to do the job. And so you've got to constantly balance it. Add a piece of equipment, add more employees, then maybe another piece of equipment. They have to fit together very intricately. All equipment has an hourly cost. You wouldn't hire a full-time employee to work 20 hours per week, nor would you buy a piece of equipment if you only need it for a very small period of time. So you want to get to know where your rental houses are. You want to start to understand, what are my options? If I don't own that piece of equipment, but I still need it occasionally, there's all sorts of options, right? We could rent it. We can do shared services with other municipalities. And oftentimes you can work with other towns, and one town owns this piece and you might own a different piece and another town owns a different piece, and you share them. That's a way to get higher productivity out of something that you don't use all the time. A shoulder machine is a great example of that, right? We wouldn't all own one because you use it, for maybe 1 or 2 days a year. But in our case here in Lewis County, the county owns the shoulder machine, and every town, we do the shoulders for them. So there's an opportunity for us to own a piece of equipment that if we owned it and just did our shoulders, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But working with all the towns, you start to make a lot of sense out of that piece of equipment. So make sure you're looking at the productivity of that piece of equipment. All right, next, buy the right piece of equipment. Quality versus price. This is a really interesting conversation, and most of you are probably very familiar with it, but in municipalities for a long time, in our bidding process, the only thing that mattered was the lowest possible cost. As a result, whether it was specifications or vendors actually starting to try to win bids on price, they started to either reduce quality or eliminate features. And we would buy that based on, we'd open the bid and, hey, this was the cheapest one. And that was our only consideration. That has since changed in New York State with best value purchasing and some other concepts that we deal with. But really, from our perspective, the question is, what makes financial sense for you? You want to buy a piece of equipment that makes sense. You don't need to buy something just because it's the most expensive. You want to buy it because it has the right features and the right mix of stuff for your situation. And the example that I always give was pickup trucks. Remember when you could buy a pickup truck off state bid? They were super cheap way back in the day, but they were the most stripped down pickup trucks you could get. There was a crank window. There was no differentials in the pickup trucks. They were as basic gets. The only problem with those trucks is they won the bid. They were cheap, but you couldn't resell it because no one wanted them. I mean, they literally had no features. Most of them came with no radio in them, no air conditioning. They were basic. And then the question is, does that truck meet your needs? Is it doing everything you want it to do? And I would argue that things like air conditioning and radio, especially now with the Bluetooth, you want your employees to be hands-free at all times. Some of those things, when you have an employee working in it 10 hours a day, matter. They're very important. So you want to start to look at that and not look just at price, but look at what are we buying? Is it, and what's the life expectancy? If you spec something that's light duty so you can get a better price, but that truck starts to fail at 5 years, where if you spec'd it with heavier components and you could get 8 years out of it, wouldn't that make more sense? Potentially. You have to do the math. So you want to start to look at quality versus price when you're purchasing things. Productivity, obviously buying the right piece of equipment enhances productivity dramatically. Little things make a huge difference, right? Getting a skid steer, for example. I can remember when I was involved in the highway departments and people would be, why would you ever need a skid steer? What would that ever do for a highway department? Now it's almost a necessity because you can buy so many different attachments for it that is a very highly used piece of equipment between, forks and I can't even tell you, there's so many things that you do with it, whether it's a rebate head or you're going out to create a lawn and you put a rock hound on it. There's just so many things you can do with it that enhances your employees' productivity. So think about what the right piece is to get the most productive environment that you can. Parts and service availability, another really important consideration when buying equipment, right? When looking at what is the right piece of equipment. I just had a conversation yesterday with a vendor who said, this is a really good product, but the nearest dealer to where my shop is 4.5 hours away. That's probably not going to work for us, irregardless of what the price is when we buy it, because we do need parts and service availability. We need to be able to contact somebody and get parts fairly quickly. So you want to start to look at those things as well. Uptime, something that very rarely gets discussed, but I go back to, that productivity and uptime are so tightly intertwined. I remember one year we went out to cut shoulders and we had the road grader, we had the force feed loader, we had 8 or 9 trucks because we had towns helping us. We had a broom sweeping, we had a roller rolling the shoulders, and we had 2 flaggers. So we had 11, 12 people out on the job. We start and the grader breaks down. Now, what does that do to our cost for that day? And it was something really simple. It was a hydraulic hose, but it happened to be a really high pressure hose with a special fitting that we couldn't find. So now I've got 11 people out on the highway with nothing to do. We sent somebody to get the hose, but for 2.5 hours, we were in a place where it didn't make sense to send all of them back and try to give them other jobs. So we had 11 people standing around for 3 hours waiting for the part to come back, get back on the grader, and get going. So the question is, what did that hydraulic hose cost us that day? And it wasn't just the hydraulic hose, it was all of the labor that didn't get used that day because of that uptime conversation. We see that all the time. This year, we had mowing tractors, 2 mowing tractors that are near the end of their lifespan, and they were broken for a month. Well, our roadsides didn't get mowed, and we couldn't get parts because of the supply chain issues right now. So we had a real uptime problem. You're buying this equipment, you're maintaining this fleet to do a job. And if it can't do that job, there's a cost to that right there, not of the actual repair, but of the lack of the work that's not getting done. So try to understand your uptime concerns and your uptime needs as well. Maintain an accurate inventory, including usage of that equipment. How many hours per year justifies ownership? And I would ask that question of everybody, and I think it's really important that we try to do that math and we try to make that case. I often see when I go into municipalities that we have a loader that we might use a couple hours a year because it's really handy to have it in that location. Well, does it justify that? And my answer to you is very clearly it does not. Which leads me to another conversation of multi-use equipment, right? If you can buy a piece of equipment that does more than one job, that's often a way to justify that ownership. So a loader is just loading trucks. Well, maybe you can combine it with something else that it can do more than one job, and now you're getting a lot more utilization with it. So, kind of the Swiss Army knife of equipment for highway departments is almost a must now. So you want your pieces to be able to do a lot of different things for you. Have current rental rates available so that you can start to do that math and go, okay, if I need it for X hours, how much is it going to cost me to rent it for that? How long will it take me to get it here? What's the availability if I do rent these things? And oftentimes when you start to do this, you have to plan ahead. I can right now rent a sweeper for next spring, but if I wait till next spring to try to rent a road sweeper, it's not going to happen. So you got to try to plan ahead if you're going to start to use rental equipment in some of these places. Can you schedule differently so that you can do this stuff? Oftentimes what we see is that equipment is a substitute for proper scheduling. It gets harder and harder to schedule as your fleet gets smaller because you've got to really think carefully about who's using what piece of equipment on what day and where's it at. So if you have lots of equipment, it makes it a lot easier. You can just start to throw people with equipment and go do the job. As you start to right size that fleet, you're going to have to start to be a little more diligent about how you're scheduling things. Shared services, different towns own different pieces. This is really one of the things that the towns do so well. I have very rarely traveled in New York State and not seen where this works. The towns communicate well, they work well together, and they understand this concept. You'll have one town that maybe has a really nice piece of equipment that the other towns don't have, and they work together. An excavator might be an example of that for towns. Not every town owns an excavator or needs an excavator, but if there's one available for that one job that you've got during the summer that you really need it for, that starts to be a really huge help. Consider how equipment affects labor productivity. We talked about this, but let's get into this a little bit more deeply. Look at annual work processes and labor involved. What I do on an annual basis is I print out all of our labor. So all of our employees keep track of what they're doing every day, whether it's cutting shoulders or digging ditches or cutting brush or whatever the process. And then we have a program where we're able to print that out. So I know exactly how many hours, man hours, are involved in this particular process. So let's say digging ditches. We're spending X number of hours digging ditches every year. And then I look at our process of how we're digging those ditches and go, is there something that I could do to increase the effectiveness of this? If I have to clean 40 miles of ditches and we're spending X labor on it, if we were to purchase a piece of equipment that would make it go faster, how would that look? So you're taking your labor costs, you're taking your equipment costs, and you're trying to see how you combine them to get that amount of work done. And if you're not getting that amount of work done, what's it going to take to do that? Is it more labor? Is it more equipment? Or is it a combination of both? And that's kind of the process that you start to look at to decide the slices in that pie. Ditching with a backhoe versus a great awl versus an excavator, right? That's a perfect example of the ditching scenario. I was doing some consulting for a very small town. They had a backhoe and they didn't have many miles of road. They had 30 miles of road and they were not digging ditches. They just were not cleaning their drainage systems out. So I sent the crew out with a backhoe with the only piece of equipment they had. And I actually timed them. I said, I want you to dig ditches all day. And at the end of the day, I measured how many feet they got done, and they actually got 0.4 miles done. And so I started to look at our system and I said, at that rate, if they spent every day all summer, it would take them 5 years to clean all the ditches in the town. That's not going to work. That's just not effective use of that labor. So in that case, what is a better solution is in that case, maybe a great awl is overkill, but maybe a rubber tired excavator. So you got to look at the situation. You got to look at the equipment cost. You got to look at what you've got to get accomplished and how do you figure that mix out. Brush with a chainsaw versus a boom mower. We talked about that, right? So we know that that's an area where you can dramatically increase productivity. And I think there's those wins in every process that we do in a highway department, is looking at how you're doing it and what the equipment is, because there's a lot of really good equipment out there that can really help our efficiency. Are there pieces that can be used for multiple things? Skid steers with attachments. Every piece of equipment now can be multifunctional. Great awl, you can get multiple attachments for the head of a great awl instead of just being a machine to dig ditches. It can be used to cut trees. It can be used to do all sorts of things. Excavators, almost everything we have, you want to start to look at. Even our trucks, right? We've already mastered the multi-use of a truck. We have plows on it. We have sanders. Then that in the summertime, we take that stuff off and we use it as a truck. Do we want to put a hitch on it and use it to tow a trailer? Start to look at how you get the most utilization out of those pieces of equipment and how that can make your crew more productive. Keep equipment properly maintained. Do not defer maintenance. This is probably the thing that gets most municipalities in trouble, is their maintenance budget is very small and they have some major breakdowns. So they do them. They have to keep the plow going or to keep their operations running. But what they don't do is some of the more the smaller items, right? They might let tires go too long before they replace them. They might let brakes go a little bit longer. So they start to defer their maintenance because their budget is all tapped out on some major repair. Well, what you've done is you've just started to increase your operating costs dramatically. By kicking that ball down the road, you're going to pay for it one way or another. I saw a poster over the weekend that I really liked that said, either schedule maintenance for your equipment or your equipment will schedule it for you. It's going to break one way or another. It's better to do it ahead of time and know what your costs are than to just kind of ignore it. And then suddenly you've got a piece of equipment that isn't really worth anything and it's got a lot of problems. So really focus heavily on that preventative maintenance. Schedule for uptime. We know that every piece of equipment is seasonal. Not every piece, but a lot of them are very seasonal. We have certain equipment that we don't use in the wintertime. We have certain equipment that we don't use in the summertime. We can schedule the preventative maintenance and make sure that it's ready so that when it's time to use it, it's ready to go. That's really important. So in the winter, get your summertime stuff ready. In the summer, get your wintertime stuff ready. That's a real simplification of it. But if you can create a plan where you're constantly working on something that's not critical at that moment, so that when it is critical, it's up and running and you're not losing the labor productivity associated with that piece of equipment. So kind of a real important component there. Use downtime wisely. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is that we know in our worlds, in the highway departments, there are times when our labor is not, super critical. And I'll give you an example. We go out and we do our plow routes and we're going to go back out in another 2 hours. It's still snowing out. We got 2 hours. what do we do with that labor pool for those 2 hours? And I've been in garages where they're sitting in a break room playing cards or they're watching TV. Those 2 hours could be used to go over that equipment and make sure that everything is going to work when they go back out in 2 hours. Make sure that there's no chafing of wires, clean it off, wash it, make sure it's ready to go, right? So using your downtime labor to help your equipment is really important. Maintaining it in a way that is effective is really, really important. Think about your resale value. This one's a little bit tricky for a lot of people, but when you buy a piece of equipment, it is our natural tendency to look at how we're going to use it and buy it only for us. And what I would suggest is that you want to do that. That's very important, that it fills your needs. But I think it's also important to think about, if I were to sell this, what would that person want on this piece of equipment? Because it can affect resale value very, very much. And I'll give you the example with a loader. Oftentimes a municipality really only needs a loader to load their trucks. So they'll buy a pin-on bucket and that's it. Just a basic bare bones loader. However, if you're going to sell that into the private market, let's say you're going to keep it for 4 years and you want to sell it. There's a lot of contractors out there who want loaders, but they want loaders for what they're doing, not what you're doing. So they want that quick coupler on the front so that they can use it in multiple ways. They want ride control. They want different options. They want a third valve and hydraulics out on the boom because they may be using it a different way. So look at the cost of adding that to your loader when you buy it, and will it return its value when you get ready to sell it? That's the question you want to look at. And oftentimes by doing that, you'll get a higher resale value, but you'll also get a machine that you find is more versatile as well. And you might find more ways to use that loader if it's set up that way. So don't just think about your use, think about how it's going to be used when you go to dispose of it. Right now, I'm buying some 10-wheelers, just haul trucks for the summertime, and I'm putting hitches on all of them. I don't have trailers for every one of them, but one, if the truck with the trailer hitch is busy, I want to be able to grab another truck and move that trailer. So I'd like them all to be set up that way. And two, when I get ready to sell it to a private contractor, they're probably going to want to haul their excavator around. So it's important to kind of think those things through when you're speccing them out new. Safety is a top priority, and I think is not talked about enough when we start to talk about maintenance. I have had conversations with a number of my colleagues, and I'll give you an example. A few years ago, a town was using a road grader, and it had some real serious issues to it, but it's all they had, and they didn't have the money to properly fix it or replace it. And we know a road grader is a very expensive investment for a lot of towns. And so they were making do. They were doing what they had to do to get their job done. Now, my question is, does that make sense, or should they park the thing, put a red tag on it, and go back to their board and say, I cannot do my job properly because I don't have a piece of equipment that I feel comfortable letting my employees operate. I personally do not want to be in a situation where I asked an employee to operate a piece of equipment and they got hurt because we were trying to make it happen. We were trying to get the job done. I would rather go back to the taxpayers or to the legislators and say, I can't do this job because I can't safely get it accomplished. One of the areas that equipment has improved dramatically is in safety features. In the last 10 years, equipment is so much safer. And I think it's really important that we keep those safety features maintained and used, because our employees are our most important asset and our most important resource. And we want to try to make sure we're taking care of them. And to do that, we have to maintain that equipment properly. So really start to think about your maintenance program in light of your employees, not just, oh, I want to keep this thing going. I want to also take care of my employees by maintaining it properly. Consider purchase price and disposal price when you're putting together a plan or when you're working on your equipment programs. This is also, we mentioned buy right, sell right. So know what that is and when to do that. The market changes, things move all over the place. But often you can either work with salespeople or you can work with your contractors in your local market and said, if I have this piece of equipment and 5 years later I go to sell it, what would the resale value be? And now with the number of online auction sites that we have, before I buy a piece, I research and go, okay, what would that piece sell for a year from now? What would it sell for 2 years from now, 3, 4, 5, and try to figure out the exact time that I'd want to try to sell that piece of equipment. So when do I want to replace it and when do I want to sell it? Those are important things to try to understand. Use your municipal discounts. Now, we're not trying to make money here. That's not the process, but we know that because of our buying power as a municipality, we get some really nice discounts. So if I buy a piece of equipment and I'm getting a really hefty discount on it, and I hold that piece for 5 years, it's getting to a point where repair costs are starting to rise, and I sell it, those discounts help cover some of the depreciation of that equipment. And I can do pretty well by selling it at the right time. So just understand that those municipal discounts help cover some of your depreciation on that piece of equipment. Buy something others want. We talked about that, right? Find out what the market for that is when you get ready to sell it. It's very interesting when you start to dig into it and you start to look into auction sites, or if you've sold much of this stuff, the markets may surprise you. Some pieces of equipment have very high resale value because there's a really good market for it. Some pieces have very little resale value because it's a very specialized piece. A shoulder machine is a great example of that, right? Pretty expensive to buy, really important for a municipality to own. Not much of a market for a used one. You're not going to get a very high resale value. So understand that with each piece. There's pieces that we buy that have a great resale value and a great market. So understanding the mix of your fleet and where you're going to dispose of them and how they're going to be used when you get rid of them is pretty important stuff. Know when to replace it. As I mentioned, try to plot out a depreciation curve, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, and try to plot out a replacement curve. Do not keep the equipment too long. This is probably where most municipalities fail, and not because they don't understand it, but because of the political realities we're in, right? You may have this great plan that you're going to replace something in 5 years. 5 years from now, we're in a really tough economy. The legislators are struggling to balance a budget. And so what's the first thing they do? Well, you can defer buying that new plow truck this year because we just don't have the money. The only problem with that is you're just deferring that cost, and you're going to pay for it one way or another. And this is the one that I see happen the most, is they start to keep the equipment too long and everything starts to fall apart. Now it loses its resale value, your operating costs start to go up, and it becomes a real problem. Keep accurate maintenance records. There are all sorts of maintenance programs out there, whether they're software programs, whether you do it the old-fashioned way with paper. I personally like software programs because you can actually keep track of what your actual operating cost for each piece of equipment is, and you want to do that. I think it's really important that you do it. AVLs, these are obviously becoming very popular. A GPS unit basically in the truck, but it gives you maintenance and service records. It gives you all sorts of stuff. AVLs are becoming a popular way to keep track of your fleet and the maintenance on that fleet. You want to have your purchase price, you want to keep your maintenance records and costs, and all of that will help you understand your cost of ownership and your percentage of uptime. So the two benchmarks that I try to look at with pieces of equipment are cost of ownership and how often is that performing when we need it to perform. And as that percentage of uptime goes down, that's also a really important consideration. So let's look at the actual math of how you figure some of this stuff out. It's called life cycle costing, or NPV. NPV is the equation that you would use to figure out life cycle costing. It is your capital cost, what you bought the piece of equipment for, minus your disposal costs. So if I bought something for $100,000 and I sold it for $10,000, my capital cost is $90,000. It is not what you paid for it. It is what you paid for it minus what you sold it for. Then you have to add in your repair costs, anything that you've done throughout the life of it to keep it up, divided by its lifespan. It's a real simple equation. Your capital cost plus repair costs divided by the number of years that you have. And that will give you your life cycle cost of every piece of equipment that you have. So you want to lay your groundwork, keep good records of all repairs associated with each piece of equipment, including the cost. Keep replacement value updated annually for every piece. Do an annual report on cost of operation for each piece of equipment. Operating costs should decrease every year. When it starts to increase, you need to replace that piece of equipment. Now, I want to show you a really kind of simple example of what I'm talking about. And that's right here. Purchase price plus repairs and maintenance divided by length of ownership. So year one, I buy a $250,000 plow truck. My operating costs in year one are $250,000. Year two, it's $250,000, but I also put $1,000 in repairs. So I take 250 plus 1,000 is 251,000 divided by 2 is 125,000. Oh, I messed up there because that's not correct, right? It's 125.5. Year three, 250 plus another 1,000 is $2,000 divided by 3, and that is $84,000. That's my life cycle cost in year 3 is $84,000 a year to own that piece of equipment. In year 2, 250,000 plus 3,000 in repairs is the 3,000 plus the 2,000 from the previous years divided by 4 years, 63,000. So see how it's going down every single year, my actual cost of ownership. Year 6, it goes down to 45,000. Year 7, it goes down to 43,000. Year 8, it goes down to 43. And you notice it starts to go back up in year 9, 250,000 plus 95,000 in repairs, plus the 45,000 from all the previous years equals 43,000. So at some point, your repairs start to get big. I got to replace a dump box. I got to put a new transmission in it. I got to put a new engine in it. That combined with all of your previous year's repairs starts to change your cost of ownership from decreasing to increasing. And what that looks like graphically is this right here. So if we have the purchase price of the piece of equipment, we have the number of years that we own it on the bottom scale, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 years. I pay $250,000 for a plow truck, and that truck becomes less and less valuable over time. That's your depreciation curve. Also, year 1, it doesn't cost me much in repairs because it's brand new and it's under warranty. Year 2, it might cost me a little bit. I got to change the oil. Maybe I got to do some service to it. Year 3 and 4, maybe I got to replace some lights. I got to start looking at tires or brakes. But at some point, those things start to become bigger, right? We got to do a transmission. And as those costs go up and they cross your depreciation curve, that is when your total owning and operating costs start to turn and go back up. So it's at that point right there is when the optimal time to sell that piece of equipment. And figuring that out for every piece of equipment is really important. It changes. Some it might be 10 years, some it might be 4 years, but you've got to start to understand that for every piece of equipment. So that's the simple math of how you figure out when to replace a piece of equipment. And you need to keep good records to do that. So NPV, life cycle costing, is capital cost plus repair cost divided by lifespan. Capital cost is acquisition minus disposition. Additional consideration is your disposition value. So the higher the disposition, the longer or the better that curve is going to look. So that's why purchasing this with a high resale value makes a lot of sense. If you buy something for $250,000 and you sell it for $8,000 for scrap value, it costs you $242,000. But if you buy something for $250,000 and you sell it sooner and it's worth 125,000, it makes a lot more sense. Now you start to have a lower operating cost. So that's a little bit about cost of ownership and the math that you do with it. Minimizing your equipment costs is your goal. So you want to focus on life cycle costing. You want to maximize your resale value. You want to minimize your repair costs. So asset values, charting your depreciation. This is one that I actually charted from a plow truck that we had purchased a number of years ago. Obviously, it was like 225,000. Now we know they're closer to 300,000. But this is how that depreciation actually started to map out. And that was looking at auction sites on a regular basis and said, what's this truck worth after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And we started to be able to really plot that. And then you can do the same thing with your repair costs. So year 1 and 2 on this particular example of 3, it was under full warranty. Then it started to come out of warranty and we started to do some service work. It was pretty flat while we were just doing oil changes and things like that. And then around year 7 and 8, we started putting in tires and brakes. And then the thing started to exponentially get more and more expensive when you start to get in particularly to emissions issues. So you want to start to look at those things and plot those out. I'm going to skip this. This is an actual example of a plow truck. I'm not going to bore you with the actual details, but that's how it all looks. Let me get out of this particular slides. But that's basically exactly how you do it. This is how that particular truck looked. It was $7,943 a year throughout the life cycle. $454 was repair costs each year. There was $2,060 in interest costs. And the total cost of operating that plow truck was $10,457 a year. This truck, this was a 2000, I did this calculation in 2012, 10 years ago. So I'm going to tell you that this number, the cost of operating a plow truck per year is probably double that. It's at least $20,000 a year to have a plow truck in your fleet. And it doesn't matter if it's brand new or if it's older, you've got to start to budget that number every year because that's what it's going to cost you, whether it's you're putting it in repairs or you're putting it in lease payments. Either way, you're going to pay for that piece of equipment. And that's how you start to figure that out. All right, so managing your fleet like this, what are some of the benefits? You hedge against inflation. Interest rates are lower than rate of inflation on equipment. That is starting to change right now as interest rates go up. So maybe leasing isn't the right way to go. Maybe now having capital available to purchase these things is the right way to start to look at it. But you want to start to leverage your depreciation and sell the vehicle when it has maximum residual value. And it creates cost predictability for your budget. One of the things that as a legislator, and in the past I have been on many boards, looking at a highway budget and seeing no expense for the replacement of equipment, and then year 4, it's $400,000. Then it's 0, 0, 0, 400. It's much better to go, okay, we're going to budget $85,000 each and every year in this budget for these pieces of equipment. It creates cost predictability, and you don't have a budget that's going up and down and up and down. So try to help your boards do that. It's much better for the taxpayers. Helps predict and control cost of use. You want to minimize your repair costs and maximize your uptime. Some benefits: newer equipment means less hours in repairs. Better equipment means more efficient use of your labor. You need less equipment, less breakdowns, obviously more uptime, and you're more efficient. You're also more safe. One of the things here when we started to do this that I was just shocked about is, for example, hearing. If anybody's driven an old plow truck, a 70s version of a plow truck, you almost have to wear hearing protection. You get in a new one, it's dead quiet. It's like driving a car. And those are small little things, but over time, when a guy gets out of a plow truck after they've been in it for 12 hours and they're not fatigued and they're not tired, that makes a huge difference in the safety of the employee as well as the public. So all of those things are the benefits of trying to get your program going and manage your equipment. Requirements: you must buy the right equipment. You got to constantly do research. You must take care of your equipment and maintain it for its resale value and for safety. You must eliminate any excess equipment. You've got to right size your fleet. It's not easy, but it helps pay for a program like this, and it helps you get into it. You must stick with the plan. That requires buy-in from your legislators. I would make sure that you have an ally on the board who is deeply involved in your maintenance and your fleet, so that you can they can be an advocate for you, because you want your legislators involved all the way through this. So some pros and cons. Managing your equipment and having an equipment management plan isn't for everyone. It's a lot of work. The bookkeeper, the clerk, the board, the attorney, the highway superintendent all have to be constantly focused on that program. The town board and highway superintendent must work as a team, and this one is often challenging, right? We know that. But when they're not working as a team, your equipment costs start to go up and the taxpayers end up paying for it. So we want to start to really, and it's really not about having new equipment or better equipment. It's about the safety of the employees, the safety of the public, and the productivity for the taxpayers. Requires constant vigilance, equipment conditions, market forces. It requires somebody to be paying attention to a program and really managing it. Some observations: relationships between the board and the highway department is critical. When I travel around New York State and go into highway garages, if I go into a highway garage where all the equipment is junk and it's really in rough shape, you often find a town that doesn't get along very well. The board does not get along with the highway superintendent, or the superintendent doesn't get along with the board. And the one relationship that they do have is the board controls the purse strings. And so if they don't trust the highway superintendent, they don't give him the money to keep the program going, then the equipment gets old and tired, and there's very little highway work going on, and they're spending all their time trying to band-aid stuff together. So and you go into places where there's a nice garage and there's good equipment, there's often a very good relationship, and it's very efficient. You'll see very good roads. So I think it's very important to focus on that relationship between your legislators and your highway department. The program should be a group effort with no one person solely responsible. Remember that running a highway department is a team effort between the legislators, the taxpayers, the employees, and the highway superintendent. So the more people you can have involved in doing that, the more important that is. Program should continue regardless of who holds office. One of the things that I see a lot is you'll get a highway superintendent who's very good and very aggressive with the equipment, and he retires or he leaves office, then the next person, it starts to fall apart, or vice versa. Trying to get a good program that outlasts any one of us involves having multiple stakeholders involved, so that it's not just dependent upon one individual. Should have a long-range plan that everyone works from, so everybody knows what page they're on and what they're doing next. That is my presentation. We're at the hour. Is there any questions? If so, please put them in the question and answer pod, and I'd be glad to address them.
While people are typing their questions, thank you, Tim, for presenting. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Amanda. I don't see any questions.
I don't either. But if you guys do have questions after, you can always email us and we can send it on to Tim.
Yep, absolutely. And if anybody wants my email address, Amanda can certainly provide that, or Cornell Local Roads, and I'd be glad to provide any information that I can to help anybody on the call. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and have a great day, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. Have a good one.
Take care.